tea loves companionship. That's everything about tea, right? It's all about companionship. Tea wants to be with you while like you're reading a book or you're going for a walk or you're sitting outside, maybe you're having like as part of your yoga practice, you have a little bit of tea afterward. You take your shavasana and then you come and sit and you have some quiet tea, right? Like tea loves being a companion, right? And so when we view ways that we can allow tea to be a companion in all the other things that we do, it's very easy to integrate, in that kind of way that's very supportive because it's something that brings us back to really the fullness of our body, right? Like the taste, the smell, the considering sensations, right? Observing how we feel in our mind, right? It has a real way of connecting all of that internal experience. It's really unique. And so I think that makes it such a nice partner to go with other things that complement that, whatever they are. They don't have to be like one particular thing. That's part of the culture of tea too, right?
Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast, your refuge for personal growth. We're all on a journey to reconnect and nurture the most authentic parts of ourselves. And in this podcast, we explore how these modern day rebels are using mindfulness to transform themselves and the world around them. Each episode will dive deep into personal interviews with social impact healers, teachers, creatives, and leaders. Through their stories and insights, you'll engage with powerful teachings to spark your mind, prompts to ignite your reflection, and techniques to integrate wisdom into your daily lives. Make sure you like, subscribe, review, and share this podcast while joining us at the intersection of mindfulness and social change that challenges the status quo, awakens our collective wisdom, and creates a world with peace, clarity, and freedom.
Very official.
Right. All right, everyone. Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast. My name is Shawn. We've been on a bit of a hiatus, but we're back for, I think this is the first episode back in 2025, at least the first episode with a guest. And so I'm excited to be here with Sooz from Being Tea. Sooz, thank you for joining in and being open to have a conversation today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks so much for the invite. This is really lovely.
Of
I
course.
was really excited to see how long your podcast has been on too. I was like, oh wow, you've been doing this for a long time. That's cool.
It's been rolling for a minute. So yeah, it's always good to continually be engaged in conversations. I always like to connect with other practitioners who are doing amazing work. I got a chance to connect with you through Tracy, who plugged us together. As I was talking to Tracy actually was a part of one of my trainings. I'm slipping which one it is that she was a part of, but she knew that I had an interest in tea. And actually, I was like, who are some other practitioners to connect with? And your name was the first one. And so I'm glad I've been able to sort of drop in and be a part of your community. And I think I might have mentioned this to you via email. I think as somebody that holds space for a lot of people all the time, it feels good to come into another space and feel that same level of care in the community that you've cultivated. So I want to say thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, I guess I should mention there might be tea sounds in the background because I'm brewing tea as we're having our conversation.
It makes total
sense.
There we
go. Nice.
Well, I think that's a good place to start. You're doing a lot of amazing work with tea and approaching tea from, I think, a very mindful perspective, one of care and reverence. With the work that you're doing with Being Tea, not only doing trainings, but also just creating community around tea. How do you get connected to tea and then, the evolution of that being tea? I always like to say this is like folks' superhero origin story. So what's yours?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it's definitely like an evolution and a journey, which is something I was really looking for, so I got started working in tea over 20 years ago. It's like 22 something ish years ago. It was a transitional career for me, which I think for a lot of folks is helpful to hear, because sometimes, we meet teachers and it seems sort of like you've always done this thing and you're very actualized and you've got it figured out, right? And it's like, no. Yeah, like I came to tea and a coffee at the time because I needed a bit of restoration, I guess. Like
Mm.
my previous career, I worked in journalism. I was a newscast producer. And for folks who may not know exactly what that job would be, it's the person who chooses all of the stories that go in a newscast and what order they go in, how long they are, and what the treatment is, and what are the highlights of the story that you're telling the viewers that night, and what's the takeaway for them, setting kind of the tone and the vibe for the show. And so I did that for a number of years, and I liked that work, but it's incredibly stressful. Like I love journalism, but it's so stressful, especially now. I couldn't imagine doing it now. It's like so stressful. And at the time, I loved coffee and tea as a beverage, but I started to notice that tea just felt differently for me. It was something that, when I was producing a show, I would always take a tea break out on the patio right before the show to just kind of center myself and
Mm.
have a break before going into the control room. And so when I decided to transition out of working in journalism, I truly had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was like, well, I know I liked working with coffee and tea, so I'm just going to do that for a while and kind of like figure out my life. And, I just really kind of fell in love with it. I didn't really question it. Like I worked for a really good company. I fit in right away with loving education and teaching people about it. I loved how, like with coffee and tea, when you approach it from a certain way, it is like this confluence of everything I loved about journalism. Like the storytelling, the research, the connection, the making meaning of things for folks. I really loved that. And so I spent about 12 or 13 years working at different companies in their training and education programs, like building curriculum and teaching workshops and doing trainings and traveling the country. And in 2015, became self-employed, decided I'm going to give this a shot, building my own thing, which was a very different path. Like as much as I really loved building curriculum and doing things for other organizations and other companies, they weren't mine and they weren't really wholly inclusive of everything that I thought tea could be. And I wanted to try what that was like, building something that could, like, can I put these things side by side? Can we put like cupping and tasting and brewing skills side by side with meditation and with life practice and things like that? Like, can we have these conversations together? And so that was my experiment. And so, yeah, Being Tea's been around for 10 years now this year.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know, right? Time flies.
Well, that was, you kind of shifted into the next question I wanted to ask you, because I think when we think about something like coffee and tea, in particular tea, and I think that sometimes those things are always kind of put together with sort of being on the go, like, let me
Hmm.
grab some coffee or tea, let me run by
Yep.
Starbucks, let me make this as I'm, in transition.
Yeah.
Maybe how did you begin to build your, you talked about using tea as like a quick sort of decompress before you were about to go in the work
Yeah.
that you were doing. How did you begin to make the connection with tea as a mindfulness practice?
Yeah. And it's like the overlap of that, I think, because that happened while I was working with it professionally, was what made me start to question, are there other ways that we can explore this together in a more like learning educational based session. So, for example, at one point when I lived in the Bay Area, I live in Chicago now, but when I lived in the Bay Area, I studied Chanoyu, which is Japanese tea ceremony,
Mm.
at the Orosanke school. And so it was lovely to experience, you know, tea from that very deeply spiritual point of view. Tea is very deeply connected to Buddhism. It likely wouldn't have survived without Buddhism in some places of the world. And so to see and experience that and to learn it from that angle and also carry some of those lessons into a service environment. Like to me, when I was behind the counter serving tea to folks, that service attitude and outlook was really, and still is, like really meaningful for me. Like I always share with folks if they're looking to learn more about tea and like really get into it or get into it professionally. And I'm like, you should try something where you're serving tea at some point. Like that's really important. Like you can't read about it and just learn about it in a vacuum. You have to serve others with it. And it will teach you so much more about tea than reading any books about it, you know? I started to connect those because I saw the way that, like, if I'm in the tea room studying Chado, the way that my sensei would teach us how to hold posture, how to breathe, how to be, how to share the bowl of matcha with somebody, the way that you should handle the teaware with care, with respect, the way that you were in conversation with people, body language, all of these things, that I could bring that into my work serving tea. You know, like I could meet people. The thing I love about like a cafe environment or a tea house environment, like you said, it is that kind of like transitional point for people. And it's so lovely to meet them in that space where it's like their private little moment between work and home and all these other things where they come and that's their moment of relief. That's their moment of like, me time. I'm doing something to care for myself. And it's like, so when you view it from that point of view, it's like, oh, that's so lovely to meet people in that spot. And so for me, like, that's how it started to connect of like all of this. It's all mindfulness. It's all a practicing and living meditation. And then some years later, I got connected with the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. And so like I study in the Plum Village tradition and the way that Thai describes that, everything's meditation, everything's a mindfulness practice. I was like, yes, I super get that now.
You
That's
know what's
absolutely what
interesting?
tea is.
It is, and what's interesting, I love that you brought Thich Nhat Hanh into the conversation because I think that I want to say, tea has been something that I've gravitated to for years. I think, and I love like in my exploration, I'm seeing that there is a very strong thread with tea and Buddhism because I realized that my
Yeah.
connection to Buddhism at such a young age was always also paired with some sort of tea, even if it was just me grabbing a
Oh,
Lipton tea bag. And so, coming full circle to see what that connection is has been really beautiful. And I've been in a little bit of a path of exploring Thich Nhat Hanh's work a little bit more in this. I want to say the last 3 months or so, I've just been in this rabbit hole of tea exploration. And so to see all of those threads sort of come together in a real beautiful way, it's been, yeah, yeah. And I want to sort of dig into what you shared because that part has been something that's been really interesting for me in my exploration. This idea of, part of the practice in itself is one of serving
yeah.
others. And even,
Yep.
I forgot what I was reading, but they even mentioned that even if you're preparing tea for yourself, it's almost in a practice of serving yourself, right?
Yes. And that's
And
how I
can you
teach
talk a
folks
little bit
like
about that?
the setup I have right here for Gong Fu style brewing, it's like I'm brewing my tea in this little pot and I'm pouring it into a pitcher. And on one hand, logistically, I don't need to do that. Like I could pour it into another cup that's big enough. But the way that like I learned Gong Fu style was that you still always use the pitcher because you are serving yourself, and so in serving yourself you learn then how to better serve others, right? So you still use all the same equipment and all the same things and the same methods even if it's just you drinking tea that day. And that always really resonated with me. Yeah.
Yeah, there was something like same. I'm got my little for those that are on
Yep. Yep.
video. It's and that was something I was like, early exploration. I'm like, okay, I get this, but this is just for me. Do I need all these things? Like I could just pour it in the cup
Mm,
and that'd be fine.
right.
Just really slowing down and realizing, no, I'm actually taking time. It's actually a compassionate sort of gesture to and for myself to
Yeah.
actually pour and then take that time with it. There's something so beautiful about that slow down and that like presence it
Hmm.
takes to be able to, handle that for yourself. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
even ask you, what are you drinking? What are you drinking?
I have an oolong today. This is a guife oolong, which means it's been bitten by little bugs, little insects in the summertime. So it's kind of like damaged, like the leaves are damaged. They got little bruises on them and little nibbles, and it makes for a sweeter tasting tea. So it's a kind of a cool tea, and that like aesthetically, maybe it's not the most beautiful tea, but it tastes great. And so tea is full of all kinds of contradictions like that, which I really love. Little life lessons in it.
That is, okay. I've been, green tea has always been my entry point. I think there's been a little ease with green tea, but in my exploration, oolongs have kind of started to become my jam now. Um,
Mm.
I like what is the way? The rock tea oolongs.
Ooh, yancha.
Yeah, I'm gravitating to those a little bit more. But with that, this is a good sort of segue to that. I think when we look at tea, the original entry point feels a little easy, but when you start to dig into the world of tea, you realize
Yeah.
there's a
Oh my
lot there.
God.
Like, there's different types, and then there's the varietals, and then in that there are different. Like, can you talk a little bit about maybe a way in which, for folks who are listening who may sort of be called to explore tea a little bit more, um, how they could enter maybe in a way that doesn't maybe feel overwhelming. Maybe some tips around that, because for me, that happened. That definitely happened for me. Where I'm
Oh
like,
yeah.
wait, okay, so okay,
Yeah.
great. There's white, there's yellow, there's green, there's oolong, there's black, and now there's pu'er, and then even under there are subcategories there too, and then even
Hmm.
that have a different taste, and yeah. So, what are your tips for maybe approaching tea in a way that doesn't potentially feel overwhelming for folks?
Yeah. What I've realized over the years, especially in working with so many students and seeing people's responses to it, like, I think there's there's things that we need to consider side by side with each other, that you're doing one thing and you also need to be aware of maintaining kind of a sense of being grounded, a sense of knowing and listening to yourself, what you need, and pacing yourself. So on the first, you want to try to expand your community. Something like tea folks on Instagram, right? There's lots of lovely tea folks on Instagram. You can learn and follow along with any of those folks, right? You could be in a community. You could like join an intentional tea community, right? So like Being Tea offers an intentional community. So there's like classes and things like that. So you have a regular connection to a people and a practice, right? So there's things that you can do to expand your inputs. On the other hand, I think in listening to ourselves, listening to when we feel that overwhelm, I think remembering that the overwhelm is natural. Like
Mm.
anytime you're learning something new and getting into it, right? Like it's natural. Push back on anything I think that tells you that the overwhelm is a sign that you're not doing something right,
Mm.
or that you need to do something harder, or you're like you're not doing it the one right way. Because the thing is, as you expand community and sources that you're learning from and listening to, there are folks who approach tea in a very like interbeing, interconnected way. So like I teach tea that way, lots of folks I know approach tea that way, in that like you can study and learn about tea from Japan alongside tea from India, right? And one way is not more important or more correct or more historically relevant than the other, right? And then there's also places where you study tea where it's like it's just this one tradition, and we believe this tradition's the superior one, right?
Mm.
Like that this is the way that, how we interpret, how we understand, like a certain kind of correctness and conformity of the vocabulary. And that to me is like, I don't think it's, the information may be helpful and relevant, but that approach is a big red flag for me. And that's where I see, like, my advice to folks would be like, if you encounter that approach, that kind of dogmatic conformity, one way behaviorist sort of thing, like I keep that at arm's length, because it can be very like you get overwhelmed and you get very self-judgy towards how you're doing things, right? And it could come from like just everyday normal tea folks, right? Like one of our friends in our space shared recently that they were checking out tea on Discord, which is like there's a whole whole range of like all the tea people on Discord, and they were in this one space where people were talking about like how they were brewing their tea, and it was very like super talking about the ratio that they're using and the temperature and how long each steep was, and being like really, and they were just like, this is the most alienating intense conversation. And I was like, yeah, because like that's one way to do it. It's not the only way. Like, like I don't have a timer while I'm doing this right now. I'm just brewing, I'm tasting, I'm adjusting. Like, you don't need to be so precise about it, right? And so like, yeah, like my thing is like, you can learn from sources like that and retrieve interesting things, but don't let that get too close to your heart. because it's really easy to let that be overwhelming. And then you judge yourself and you say, I'm not doing this right. And if at any point you think I'm not doing this right, that space is not for you. It has nothing to do with you. It's that space.
Mm. That actually sort of brings me to my next, because I've gone down, I feel like the YouTube rabbit hole of the tea folk, and there are folks that it's like, if you don't do it just like this, and this is the way, and then it should taste just like this, and if it's 3 seconds in one, 3 minutes in one,
Super. Yep.
yeah. How do you get, or maybe even talk about your journey with tea? Like, at what point did you get to that space of comfortability where it felt more intuitive, right? Like, it wasn't that I'm
Yeah.
setting a timer, this is a green tea, so it needs to
Yep.
be steeped this time with this many ounces of tea. To where did you get to, or how did you get to that comfortability in your own tea
Yeah.
journey to just
You
listen
know,
to it?
yeah, that's a great question. Like, I will say, and this is something it influences how I am as a teacher too. Like, I was really fortunate and I was exposed to that very early on. I had like some great folks that I worked with at my first tea company. I got my journey started working for Pete's Coffee and Tea way back in the day when they had like a really deep training department and things like that. And so I remember like our trainers talking about like changing the water temperature and the steep time and being really flexible about things. And they were like, yeah, so there's a recommendation on this for if you try this recipe that's on here, you'll get a good result. We've tested it. Like, this will give you a good result, but it's not the only result.
Mm.
And one of the breakthroughs for me, for example, was I had a trainer in my first year working there where they recommended. So there's a specific tea from India, from the Darjeeling region, which is near the Himalayas. It's called a first flush tea, and it just means like the first growth of the season. It's a spring tea. It's like the very first tea that's picked of the year, first flush. It's beautiful tea. It's very sensitive to water temperature because like it's just the little baby tea buds, and it's so new and delicate leaf. But it's normally brewed like just any other black tea, really hot boiling water and such. And I remember having a trainer who was like, if you try brewing this like a white tea, just a little bit cooler water temperature, just notice how like the bite is so much softer and it's so much sweeter. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna try this. And it was like a revelation to me. Like, I was like, oh my god, this tea is so good. And that I could appreciate it both ways. Like, one way was not more correct than the other. And that was such an important, like, subtle message to give to someone who's just starting out. Like, it was so lovely. I remember, like, I joined the training team after I'd been working there for like a year and a half or 2 years. And it's just a small team. Like, we were 10 people responsible for all the mentoring for everybody, for the whole company. And we had a real sense of camaraderie around that mission of like not being dogmatic about it, like really instilling genuine, deep, deep love and experimentation around tea and making it your own, and coffee too. And that meant a lot to me. It really, really influenced me as a teacher. Like, a topic that I really enjoy teaching about in tea is how to taste. It's like cupping and evaluation and how to like describe tea. My first day working professionally in coffee and tea, my trainer set up like a big old tea tasting, done cupping style with the professional equipment and everything, and didn't make a big deal out of it. Was just like, hey, we're going to taste some tea. Let's hang out. And that was like my class. And it was like 2 hours of like
Just
tasting tea and just talking about it. And again, like, it's such an important message to send to somebody who's just starting, because later, like years later, I'm reflecting on that. And I realized, like, as I started getting involved in like industry training and with trade groups and teaching other professionals about tea, how few people were exposed to something like that. Like, usually you had to like earn it. You had to earn the right to be respected in that kind of way. And I was like, oh no, like, everybody should be given that. Like, why would you withhold that from somebody? Like, that's rude. Like, we treat everybody like that, And so like, I have viewed that then as like, I'm going to teach everybody everything I know. And there's no like earning that, and there's no holding that back or being very gatekeepy about it, because you just see the environment that it allows to flourish when you are generous with what you know. And it was really sad to encounter that that was not most people's experience. I was like, damn it, that's not cool. You know, you should do something about that. So I try to encourage that in my students, like be generous with what you know.
Mm. I love that. I love that idea of like like there's enough room for everybody out here. Share the information,
Yeah.
give people what they need, so that they can be able to tap into that. You know, what question that actually sort of like popped developed another question as you were sharing, and I think this is a good question for folks who might be, you know, listeners of the podcast. I know a lot of folks are practitioners, and then also folks who teach. And typically, I feel like when we're
Mm.
practitioners of work, we're sort of connected to something that we are passionate about. How do you balance like your passion and sort of love of tea with engaging in it in a way that is also like work and business and like how do you balance that um, with, you know, still connecting with it as something that you hold personal and dear to you?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I don't know if there's like a one correct way. I don't believe there's a one correct way about most things, but um, for me, the thing that worked was doing something that comes from what I want to express, you know, because before, like I've described it to people as I kind of felt like I was living two separate identities. I had like
Mm,
my professional industry self, and then I had like my personal self. You know, I had the one that studied like tea meditation and Japanese tea ceremony and you know, like had this very personal connection. And then I had the professional one that was the public facing. And that was a really weird thing for me. You know, I'm autistic. That's something where like having that kind of dual personality doesn't really work well.
mm,
Sometimes it feels very exhausting. And so part of the work when I started practice and my work under being T was like I want to bring these two identities together. I can't try to pretend to be two different versions of myself anymore, and that has made like the burnout much more like manageable, like on a seasonal level. Like I overwork, I'm a little tired, you know, kind of thing, but I don't ever feel like um oh, I hate tea, I'm so sick of tea. You know, like I once had like I was giving a bunch of classes at Duke University, and I remember one of the classes like we had like this big tea meditation circle that we were doing, and before we got in our session we did a little tea Q&A, and one of the students asked about something similar like this about like burnout. They were like, how do you get so into something that you really love but you don't want to like come to hate it? And I could tell this person was asking this as a student and as someone who's like navigating that of like I'm kind of hating the things that I used to love. What do I do? And so like I paused and I'm like really thinking about how do I answer this, because I don't want this kid to like hate the things that they love. And I was like, well, you know, because they asked me like, have you ever had burnout with tea? And I was like, I've not had burnout with tea. I've had burnout with how I worked with tea, and that's a big difference.
mm,
And so if I had not changed how I work, I think I would have continued to go down that path and I likely would have turned away from it. And I had to realize it's not tea, it's how I'm working with it. And that made all the difference.
mm. That was a gem. I'm sitting with that because I think there's a really big distinction that I don't think we always think about. Like it's not the thing, it's
Yeah.
how I'm relating to or connecting with it or working with it.
Yep.
Hmm. Hmm. I say this, my listeners are probably going to be sick of hearing me say it. They're probably mouthing it now. I'm like, every time I talk to a guest or have somebody on the show, it's like there's always something they share that I'm like, I needed to hear that thing. So
Oh, I'm so
yeah,
glad.
thank you, thank
I'm
you.
so glad. No, it's really easy for that to creep in, you know? Like I think another example of how I learned this, like when you asked earlier, like where did I learn some of this from, of how to sort of like be in relationship with tea in that kind of way. You know, one of my other mentors, who is somebody I worked with at we worked for a nonprofit training organization that does T classes and certifications for folks in the industry. And she was the director of the program. Her name's Donna Fellman. She's an amazing T person, now since retired. But, you know, I remember early on when working with her, she loved to surround herself with like specialists, people who were really expertise in different areas, you know? And so she, you know, like I thought of me as like a specialist in a kind of way of like teaching style and approach and such. And she, you know, she had as a degree in education. And she's like, I'm a generalist though. Like, and to me, that's where the most flexibility comes from, is being able to network and infuse and get into spots. But like, I'm not going to be the one who teaches like this really super deep, intensive lecture about like, you know, regions in Taiwan. Like, I'm going to bring in this person that's their expertise. Like, I can support them, but I'm not going to like try to be that. And again, like just another one of those like really deep life lessons. I was like, I started to realize how I identify as that. You know, like I'm comfortable being a generalist. And I think that that's really, especially I'm seeing now the deeper I go in my journey, that's really, it's honestly very appropriate, because like I don't have that life experience of somebody who's like lived and grown up on a tea farm and it has made tea their whole life, right? I can't talk from that point of view, right? So I have different experience. And it was great to have somebody role model that and not do it from a place where it feels like she was talking down about her abilities or viewing like, oh, there's something I could have achieved in my life, but I didn't, so now I have to settle for this, right? Like, it's okay that you're not like a Japanese tea master or something. That was not for you, right? It's fine. You're still doing like really great and important and needed work, you know? And that was just a really great thing to have role modeled for me, you know? And so that's kind of also what made me think of like how you approach it. If I had continued on some sort of path of trying to be like a really deep specialist in a certain area, I think I would have gotten burnt out. Like, I like the broader approach and just kind of like being in the center of like a little circle and seeing everything like move and circle around you, and you just understand how all connected these things are. It's like being at the center of a tree and looking at like being able to count all the rings around you, and you're like, wow, like all this wisdom and knowledge and everything that's around me and supports me, and I don't have to do anything to try to like, I don't have to earn that, I don't have to influence it, it just is. We just like the interbeing of all of that. I was like, that's beautiful. I like being in that spot. I no longer feel like I'm inadequate somehow. You know, I had like let go of all that feeling of being inadequate and not enough.
Yeah, I needed to hear that. Thank you. Thank you for Thank you for sharing that. I'm sitting with that because I feel like that's a real I think that's a real place folks can be, you know, and as folks are emerging as practitioners and teachers in spaces and holding space with different practices and modalities. I think it's easy to sort of lean into that space where either you're overcompensating because you feel like you're not enough in the space, but knowing like how do you want to show up in the work,
Yeah.
your lane in the work, I think it does help you. And I love that you mentioned this idea of like, I need to integrate my whole self in how this is showing up for me so that it feels coming from that truly grounded and authentic space. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's not just something like you do as your work. I mean, it can be. I think people who do it just as their work and have a healthy relationship with it are also people who are supported in other areas outside of that, you know. And like they have other things that they do and they're interested in. And for me, like largely tea is the main and the only thing. You know, that's another kind of autistic trait, right? You know, so it's like people go, what other hobbies do you have? And I'm like, I mean, I do have houseplants. I do really like houseplants now. That's kind of maybe a hobby. But otherwise, like, I don't really have other hobbies. So I had to have like a really healthy relationship with tea if that was going to be like my one main thing that I do. Yeah. Because otherwise the burnout I think is really, there's a high risk for that.
Yeah. I guess the last question I would ask you, Sooz, is, you know, for someone who has maybe an ongoing mindfulness or, you know, spiritual practice, stillness practice, fill in the blank word practice, so what's a practical way to maybe work tea into that ongoing or current practice of theirs?
Yeah, it's really great. I think one of the things that was helpful for me was viewing that like it doesn't need to take as much time as you think. Like you could sit and enjoy tea for an hour, right? But if you don't have that, you could also just integrate like just 5 minutes or something where you just sit and you enjoy a couple sips and then you move on with your day, right? So having it be like an adjunct to other things that you might do. Tea loves companionship. That's everything about tea, right? It's all about companionship. Tea wants to be with you while like you're reading a book or you're going for a walk or you're sitting outside, maybe you're having like as part of your yoga practice, you have a little bit of tea afterward. You take your shavasana and then you come and sit and you have some quiet tea, right? Like tea loves being a companion, right? And so when we view ways that we can allow tea to be a companion in all the other things that we do, it's very easy to integrate, in that kind of way that's very supportive because it's something that brings us back to really the fullness of our body, right? Like the taste, the smell, the considering sensations, right? Observing how we feel in our mind, right? It has a real way of connecting all of that internal experience. It's really unique. And so that I think that makes it such a nice partner to go with other things that complement that, whatever they are. They don't have to be like one particular thing. That's part of the culture of tea too, right? Like this season right now, we're having this talk. It's spring, right? In Japan, this is like approaching Hanami season, viewing the cherry blossoms, right? And so the whole culture of appreciating the briefness of cherry blossom season, you go out, you spread out a picnic blanket and some tea and some snacks underneath the cherry trees as they're like sprinkling their little blooms around. And it's a reminder of like the impermanence of things, that you just check in with the present and you're here with people and you're here with tea and you're enjoying like this really brief time in spring that only comes around once a year. And over the whole of your lifetime, you think of how many springtimes will you be able to observe this? Not many, so it gives you that opportunity to really appreciate every single one of those, right? Tea is a companion for everything, so yeah, I think it does integrate really well into all kinds of different practices people have. But I think if we let go of any sort of like, maybe not belief, but like impression that someone or somewhere that you've gotten that it needs to take a certain amount of time or look a certain way, has a certain formality or structure to it. Again, one of the other like really beautiful things that I have loved from Thich Nhat Hanh, like tea ceremony, air quotes there, is as simple as sitting down and drinking tea. It's not, you don't need all of the things. Right? And I love that. It's so much more welcoming and compassionate and accepting of life circumstance that you are enough as you are. Yeah. So just drink tea.
Just drink the tea. Just drink the tea.
Drink tea. Remember that tea loves you. That's all you need.
Sooz, thank you. This has been a great conversation. Want to say just say thank you for the time to chat. Where can folks find you? What do you got shaking? What are some ways folks can engage with your work? Let folks know.
Yeah. So let's see. So my website is beingtea.com. And when you go to beingtea.com, you'll see like different programs that we have. For example, like we talked about like teaching and mentorship here today. So we have a teacher training program that's for folks who have like a deep relationship with tea, but they're wanting to extend that and think about how they hold community and facilitate with others or integrate that into things that they already do. We have a member community, which has like classes and gatherings and things that are very like really expansive topics about tea, very like non-dogmatic, very just like tea life exploration. Yeah, like those are kind of like the main programs we do. We have a tasting box club where people can join and get tea every month. It's all centered around like an educational theme. The way that we do tea here, I kind of like to describe it sometimes as like, it's like watching grass grow is the way that I like to teach tea, and that it's like the really small little details and having appreciation for the small details. Right. So like we have a class coming up this month about how to brew tea in boiling water. Because it's like one of the biggest no-nos that you hear. It's like, no, you like never brew tea in boiling water. It'll ruin it. It's like, not always. That's not really true, actually. Let's talk about that, right? So we teach like really small, kind of specific topics like that because like that's how I learned tea was people centering the appreciation for small. You know, so we don't do like big old like lecture intensive series here or courses that have quizzes and tests. Like it's just really small, very gentle things. Like let's play with tea, brewing and boiling water, see what happens. Like those are the classes I teach. And I'm also on Instagram at Being Tea. You can find me there too.
Beautiful. Well, listen, all of that information, if you're watching on YouTube, it's in the description. If you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, it is also in the show notes. So please make sure you follow, go to the website, get on the mailing list, follow on IG, all the things. And yeah, Sooz, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is lovely. I love talking about like tea life from this perspective and tea education and what it means to us. Yeah. It's a great conversation, so thank you.
Of course. Hey, Rebels, thank you for joining us on another episode of the Mindful Rebel podcast. Remember, after this listen, ask yourself where wisdom can meet practice and where compassion can meet action. Take a moment today to reflect on what resonated with you in this episode. Now, if you're feeling that rebel spirit, I'd invite you to like and share this episode. Your support helps spread the message of mindfulness, self-inquiry, and self-discovery. And if you're feeling extra generous, and I know you are, leave a rating and a review of the podcast. It helps others find this resource on their own mindfulness journey. May you move into the rest of your day with a greater sense of peace, clarity, and freedom.